Imagine a time when Americans believed that anything was possible. A time when we had faith in our institutions, family, the church, our employers. Imagine a time when human life was so sacred that we'd do almost anything to save or prolong it. That was America 30 years ago. That was when we believed in President Johnson's vision of the Great Society. It was after President Kennedy's assassination, after the Beatles first came to the U.S., and after the emergence of the free speech movement at Berkeley. That was when we decided to do something about the numbers of people who were killed and maimed in vehicle accidents. That was when we became intrigued by the possibility of challenging the inevitability of sudden death. That was when the modern era of EMS was born.
Shining bright for those who respond, and day and night for the rise of fine. Their hands that hold, the backs that lift, the hearts of gold for the rescuers on whom the world depends. The light from the star never ends.
Hi, I'm Jim Page, your host on this trip through the history of emergency medical services. We're in Roanoke, Virginia, home to a museum that honors all of our country's rescuers and commemorates the vision and leadership of Julian Stanley Wise, founder of the Roanoke Life-Saving and First Aid Crew. In order to fully appreciate modern EMS, we need to take a quick look at how things were in the earliest days of organized rescue, as early as the 1920s. Julian Wise formed the nation's first volunteer rescue service in 1928. Earlier, in most American communities, whenever someone became stranded in a rising river, or had difficulty breathing, or broke a leg, or suffered a serious laceration, bystanders would simply wring their hands and hope that a quick ride to the nearest hospital would save the victim. In those days, a cardiac arrest was an absolute, irreversible death sentence. The concept of trained rescue and first aid personnel ready to come to the immediate aid of those whose lives were in jeopardy was very exciting. The Roanoke example got a lot of publicity, and within a few years, hundreds of volunteer rescue squads were formed, mostly in the eastern and southern states. By the 1950s, these organizations were an essential part of public safety in thousands of American communities. During the mid to late 1950s, the American public began to hear and read stories about breakthroughs in the field of rescue medicine. At Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Dr. James Elam was studying a little-known procedure which he had read about in the medical literature. It was called mouth-to-mouth rescue breathing. At Johns Hopkins, Dr. Elam published his successful research on sustaining life with expired air. But his research findings were not readily accepted. Then, in 1956, Dr. Elam traveled home from a medical conference in Kansas City with a young anesthesiologist from Baltimore City Hospital by the name of Peter Saffer. Dr. Saffer also was fascinated with the idea of improving emergency resuscitation, and back home in Baltimore, he enlisted Martin McMahon, then chief of the Baltimore Fire Department's ambulance service, to encourage firefighters to participate in experiments. McMahon later recalled how those firefighters agreed to be paralyzed with curare to have their natural breathing impulses stopped for up to 2 hours, while Dr. Saffer and trained rescuers used various techniques, including mouth-to-mouth breathing, to maintain their blood gas levels. In addition, 39 physicians, medical students, and 1 nurse also courageously volunteered to be paralyzed and have a dozen laypersons try various techniques of artificial ventilation to see what happened. What worked best was mouth-to-mouth ventilation using exhaled air. On the West Coast, we first heard about the Baltimore experiments in about 1960. By that time, it had been recommended by the National Academy of Sciences. My partner and I started teaching the new rescue breathing technique to school kids and service clubs and families with swimming pools. Then we were ordered to stop. We were both first aid instructors, but mouth-to-mouth breathing had not yet been approved by the Red Cross, so we were told not to teach it. Meanwhile, the Johns Hopkins group, which included doctors W.B. Cowenhoven, Guy Knickerbocker, and James Jude, were experimenting with the use of electricity to shock a fibrillating human heart back into rhythm. On May 11, 1959, after 6 years of development sponsored by the Edison Electric Institute, the Hopkins researchers took delivery of the first ever portable defibrillator. It weighed 45 pounds. It seemed that technology offered all kinds of solutions, but an even bigger challenge was to preserve the pulseless, non-breathing patient during the several minutes it would take to get a defibrillator to the scene. Peter Saffer credits the original Johns Hopkins research team, Cowenhoven, Knickerbocker, and Jude, with meeting that challenge by developing cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or CPR. This holding pattern, so to speak, a combination of ventilations and closed chest compressions, could contribute to survival from cardiac arrest. The concept was very simple. Ensuring the ABCs, airway, breathing, and circulation, was meant to be a stopgap measure that anyone could learn. CPR may have been intended for anyone to learn, but almost 15 years passed before the American Heart Association and the Red Cross established standards for training the general public. However, in the meantime, CPR became the instrument of change for rescue and ambulance personnel, and it greatly elevated public expectations.
One of the nation's leading thoracic surgeons has written that Jacksonville is the safest place in the world to have a heart attack. The reason is the heavy emphasis placed on cardiopulmonary resuscitation, called CPR. It's a method to restore breathing when the lungs have quit, heart when it has stopped. Every Jacksonville fireman is required to know how to employ CPR.
But the course of progress toward modern emergency medical services actually was plotted along two different pathways. While the cardiologists and resuscitation researchers were exploring the potential for saving heart attack victims, surgeons were seeking solutions to the loss of lives from trauma, particularly auto accidents. In 1966, I was a fire captain here at Station 69 at Topanga Canyon in the mountains between Malibu and the San Fernando Valley, northwest of Los Angeles. Our first in-district included many miles of winding mountain roads. We were first on scene at every vehicle accident in a 75-square-mile area, and there were lots of them. A typical wait for an ambulance was 20 minutes to an hour. At the time, we thought we were quite good at rescue and first aid. On the other hand, nobody had taught us the importance of immobilizing necks. We didn't have the equipment necessary to apply traction to a fractured femur. For suction, we had to use this old gas-powered aspirator on an E&J resuscitator. This and the old Emerson resuscitator were considered state-of-the-art at the time.
We had the old Emerson resuscitators that were in a great big suitcase. They were extremely heavy. The oxygen bottles were extremely heavy. And they could only be used to ventilate a patient if you were not doing chest compressions. If you did chest compressions, it would cause it to cycle, and they were totally ineffective.
This is an Emerson resuscitator. These were used on the job when I came on in 1961. This weighs probably 45 to 50 pounds. When you would go on what we call resuscitator runs, or to a person to have a breathing or heart attack, by the time you carried this up to the second or third floor, which was fairly common for downtown companies, you felt like you needed this for yourself rather than for the patient.
We had no EMS magazines or newsletters 30 years ago. We couldn't intubate airways or start IVs or administer medications. We had no backboards. We weren't allowed to carry stethoscopes. The Stokes stretcher was our main tool for moving patients. I remember receiving an advanced first aid card in the mail with my name on it, even though I had received no refresher training and hadn't even taken a test. In 1965, a dubious record was set in America. For the first time, more than 50,000 Americans died in highway accidents during a single year. More Americans than were killed in Vietnam over 8 years of warfare. President Johnson proposed to the Congress a Highway Safety Act, which included creation of a federal agency, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Even in the states that were trying to do something about the problem, there was so much we didn't know and so much we took for granted. For example, this accident victim apparently suffered a laceration to his forehead. The state-of-the-art 30 years ago didn't even consider the possibility of spinal injury. As often as not, the neck would be used as a convenient appendage from which an arm sling could be suspended. The federal highway safety effort was based on 18 standards, including such things as improved highway design, a uniform and improved system of highway signs, stricter enforcement of drunk driving laws, and improvements in emergency medical services. To meet Standard 11, the EMS standard, federal funds were spent on a new basic training curriculum for ambulance personnel. Using its authority under the Highway Safety Act, the new Federal Traffic Safety Agency also encouraged other federal agencies to start redesigning radio communication systems for pre-hospital care and transportation, and to redesign the ambulance vehicle itself. At the same time the President was establishing the National Highway Traffic Safety Agency, the National Academy of Sciences was given the opportunity to study accidental death and disability and to report on their findings. The results of their study were very revealing. Released in 1966, the report, titled Accidental Death and Disability, the Neglected Disease of Modern Society, stated that there were virtually no standards for ambulance personnel, with some being poorly paid employees of funeral homes and others enthusiastic volunteers with little or no training. Also called the White Paper, the report stated that the public in general had no appreciation for the problem of accidental death and injury, and that millions of Americans lacked even basic training in first aid. It also stated that although it was possible to communicate with astronauts in space, communication was seldom possible between an ambulance and the emergency department it was approaching. 30 years ago, telephone exchange boundaries usually didn't coincide with city or county boundaries, so you couldn't count on dialing an operator who'd be able to put you in touch with the correct emergency service. The public was forced to try and remember separate 7-digit numbers for emergency service in each of the thousands of local jurisdictions. At public safety and ambulance dispatch centers in many locales, some of the people who staffed dispatch centers were disabled firefighters or police officers, regardless whether they had an interest in or aptitude for the job of a telecommunicator. Address information usually was recorded on files or cards that had to be accessed manually. Most dispatch information was written by hand on pads of paper and then passed on to another dispatcher for activation of emergency units. The process was slow, and the opportunities for error were numerous. The White Paper of 1966 recognized the problem and stated that it would seem feasible to designate a universal, easily remembered number for all dial telephones throughout the nation. The report, reflecting medicine's state of mind at the time, recommended that pilot programs be conducted to determine whether it might be beneficial to staff ambulances with physicians. What happened, of course, is the development of paramedics instead. 30 years later, after a close review of its specific recommendations, the EMS White Paper doesn't seem to be a visionary document. Does it really deserve credit for ushering us into the modern world of emergency medical services? Yes and no. As much as anything, the report probably was a catalyst that arrived at an opportune time. Coupled with the federal government's commitment to reduce the number of highway deaths and injuries through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and the assumption that virtually any problem could be solved with government money, the White Paper was an effective tool for helping to organize statewide trauma care systems in Illinois and Maryland, from which all other trauma systems were eventually developed. Carl Soderstrom is a trauma surgeon who worked with Dr. R. Adams Cowley in the early days of developing the Maryland statewide EMS system and the world-famous Shock Trauma Center in Baltimore.
30 years ago, many victims of trauma simply died unnecessarily because we didn't appreciate the importance of time. But evolving research taught us that if bleeding wasn't stopped in time, then irreversible shock set in. Largely due to the clinical and research experience of Dr. Cowley, after whom this institution is named, we learned about the critical factor of time right after injury. That period, which Dr. Cowley liked to refer to as the golden hour, is the time during which the patient needs to be extricated, stabilized, and rapidly transported to a trauma center. There, teams of specialists are in place to identify life-threatening injuries and treat them.
Meanwhile, in 1966, across the Atlantic Ocean in Belfast, Northern Ireland, Dr. J. Frank Pantridge, a cardiologist, was experimenting with the delivery of emergency cardiac care. He set up a vehicle for quickly taking emergency cardiac care to the patient's side rather than waiting for the patients to arrive at the hospital. Dr. Pantridge's emergency response team consisted of a nurse and a cardiac technician. They would travel from the Royal Victoria Hospital in a vehicle that carried an EKG monitor, defibrillator, oxygen, and ventilation equipment, and cardiac drugs. After about a year, Pantridge reported a significant improvement in the rate of survival from out-of-hospital cardiac emergencies. Dr. Pantridge published the results of his research in The Lancet, a British medical journal. His American colleagues were fascinated by his findings and invited him to speak at the annual meeting of the American College of Cardiology. Within a few months, several American cardiologists were developing experimental programs to duplicate or improve upon Pantridge's experience in Belfast. In New York City, an emergency coronary care program was established here at St. Vincent's Hospital on the edge of Greenwich Village. It served an area of several blocks surrounding the hospital. Dr. William Grace, who created the program, originally used medical interns and cardiology residents. Later, however, paramedics were trained to staff the mobile unit. Initially, in Columbus, the emergency coronary care program used cardiology fellows from the Ohio State University Medical School, but later staffed the mobile unit with specially trained Columbus firefighters. In Miami, Seattle, and Los Angeles, firefighters were selected and trained from the outset. A similar program was evolving in Jacksonville. In San Francisco and Portland, Oregon, private ambulance personnel were chosen for training in emergency coronary care techniques. About the same time, we first began to hear the term paramedic. Miami, Florida was one of the first programs to get up and running. Dr. Eugene Nagel and his partner Jim Hirschman co-founded the paramedic program in Miami. Dr. Nagel practiced here at Jackson Memorial Hospital. As did his colleagues in other American cities, he faced the question of how he would staff the new mobile coronary care unit. There were no extra people here at Jackson Memorial who could be trained and deployed. So Dr. Nagel turned to another resource, the Miami Fire Department.
The reason to use the fire department is they were there, they were strategically distributed throughout the city. They had the radios, the vehicles, the training to work in the street. All we had to do was to add a few life-saving techniques to what they already knew.
In order to get the support of Miami's fire chief, local elected officials, and his fellow physicians, Dr. Nagel, who's also an electrical engineer, designed and assembled the equipment to transmit EKGs from the field to the hospital.
And you have to remember that we had no training devices, we had no training manuals, and so we had to convince the fire chief, among others, that it was okay to intubate. And we did that by having the 6 paramedic trainees intubate, first me and then the resident. And when we took that evidence to the fire chief, he said, okay, I guess the paramedics are ready to intubate in the field.
It was from this fire station that America's first paramedics responded, at first with a physician on board, but later on their own. Dr. Nagel recalls the system's first defibrillation in the field without a physician present.
And the first one in the Miami system was in June 1969. The subject was Dan Jones, and he was an inebriate that we knew well, only this time he was in ventricular fibrillation. Captain Padron asked for and received the orders to defibrillate, and it was successful, and Dan was out of the hospital very quickly, in 6 days, in fact. But then it was interesting. He wore a clean white shirt when he came to the fire station. He seemed not to drink, and we thought that this might be a new cure for acute alcoholism.
The implications of the work of Pantridge and Nagel were nationwide. While the NAS White Paper had suggested the need for standardized first aid and rescue training and pilot programs to explore the possibility of placing physicians on ambulances, it was the new emergency coronary care programs that truly opened the door to expanded knowledge, skills, and tools for rescue and ambulance personnel. Consider the following comments from that time in our history.
Well, these squadmen are very capable men, and after having trained 3 classes, I would be willing to place my life in their hands any time.
The caliber of the people in rescue in Jacksonville was unbelievably high. And the skills that these young people had developed was awesome to me. And I just think that all the doubts disappeared.
Okay, we're about ready to go.
Before the Heartmobile came into service, it was really a traumatic experience to have someone die in your arms when you can't help them.
John Harold, paramedic.
Now we can really do a job. We can treat them at the scene. We're going to run them to the hospital in one big hurry.
Don't you know that I heard it through the grapevine? Not much longer would you be mine. Oh, I heard it through the grapevine.
1968, AT&T reserved the digits 911 nationwide for emergency use, and the first 911 call was made in the little town of Haleyville, Alabama. Also in '68, the first step was taken toward recognizing emergency medicine as a specialty when the American College of Emergency Physicians was formed. To put the times in context, 1969 witnessed the fulfillment of one of mankind's most ambitious dreams, as astronaut Neil Armstrong took the first giant step on the moon. In a more earthly achievement, the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons created a basic life support training course for ambulance personnel. The American College of Cardiology devoted its 6th Bethesda Conference to the topic of early coronary care, and experimental pre-hospital ALS programs were getting underway in Los Angeles and elsewhere. We'd like you to meet one of the first 6 firefighter paramedics in LA County, Gary Davis, who just may be the longest continuously certified paramedic in the U.S.
In August 1969, I was working at Fire Station 36 in the city of Carson. One morning, our captain, Bill Town, gathered us all together and, reading from a memo, said that Harvard General Hospital wanted 6 volunteers to start in a new rescue program where we were going to be sticking needles into people's hearts. It was very difficult for us at first, since all the information being taught to us was new. We were being instructed in things only doctors were allowed to do. Dr. J. Michael Criley put us into a cardiac care unit with 30 nurses. We were all very surprised after the final exam. The 6 firemen scored number 2 through number 7. Of course, we had a lot of extra help from Dr. Criley and our training nurse, Carol Bebo. Our first drug box was an old doctor's bag, but the drugs that we kept in there were glass vials and ampules and kept breaking. So one of the nurses, Diane Christie, went out and bought us a fish and tackle box, and the rest is history.
It was still the era of plenty here in the United States. State and federal governments were searching for solutions to the parallel problems of sudden cardiac death and death and disability due to trauma. In Illinois and Maryland, statewide trauma care systems were being constructed as national models. The Department of Transportation's new EMT curriculum was released, new training textbooks were being written, and Congress was being encouraged to fund a major national program for improvement of EMS. After constructing the Illinois statewide trauma system, Dr. David Boyd was appointed as director of the National EMS program. For 8 years, he tirelessly pursued the vision of a systems approach to EMS throughout the U.S.
You have to account for distances. You have to account for environmental hazards. You have to account for getting trauma victims out of chasms and various. You have to account for multiplicity of disaster and many disaster responses. This can only be done effectively, and the public can only support this if, in fact, it's a medically sound, medically defensible, and rationally driven systems concept.
Although the federal programs eventually would have a lot of impact on rescuers and emergency care providers all over the country, a little accident of history would influence public expectations more than what was being planned in Washington. In 1971, while Dr. Boyd and his colleagues were building the Illinois trauma system and training programs were being developed for the new position of emergency medical technician, I was assigned to Station 7 here in Hollywood, just off the Sunset Strip. We were unaware of all the important developments that were occurring back east, but we were very aware of our own fledgling advanced life support program, where some of our firefighters were being trained to do all the things that we'd always been prohibited from doing, and then some. For lack of an official title, we followed the example of Miami, and we called them paramedics. It was May 1971 when we had a special visitor here at Station 7. He was a television producer, and he was looking for somebody who could do some research for him for a proposed new television series on rescue. So while Congress and state legislators were deliberating on how best to attack the problems of accidental death and disability, an unlikely form of public education was about to be introduced to America and the world on entertainment television.
of chemicals are stored in the tanker. Use caution.
It was just a matter of luck, being in the right place at the right time. At the time, our fire department had trained less than a dozen paramedics, but we were absolutely convinced that this was the future of rescue and emergency services. When the world premiere of Emergency first broadcast in December 1971, there were only 12 paramedic rescue or ambulance units in the entire country. 10 years later, more than half of all Americans were within 10 minutes of a paramedic. That simply would not have happened without the impact of emergency. All of a sudden, a whole generation of kids began to announce that they wanted to be paramedics when they grew up. As an example of the influence of emergency, please meet A.J. Heitman, Vice President of GEMS Communications.
I grew up in a fire department family. My father was a captain in charge of the Scranton Fire Department Ambulance Division. About the age of 9, he began to sneak me along on ambulance calls and enjoyed that, enjoyed helping people, and began to get some training. About the age of 16 or 17, though, I got my first exposure to emergency and Johnny and Roy popping bicarbs and saving lives, and really at that moment I knew I was hooked.
Help me, come on, somebody help me now. I'll take you there. Help me, y'all. I'll take you there.
About this time, EMS was challenged when Hurricane Agnes ravaged the eastern U.S. President Nixon visited China while conflict brewed at home over the Watergate burglaries, and the world's first oil crisis caught our attention. Encouraged by the successful use of helicopters for medical evacuation in Korea and Vietnam, the U.S. Departments of Transportation and Defense created a program which used Army medevac helicopters at selected bases for transporting civilian trauma victims and other critical patients where long distances and time were important. The program eventually was eclipsed by hospital-based and other civilian air medical services. At about the same time, following the pioneering use of helicopters by St. Anthony's Hospital in Denver, hospital-based air medical programs were developed in numerous locales. In some areas, public safety helicopters were given the expanded role of medical transportation. Within a few years, all but a few areas of the U.S. were served by air medical transportation services. Several associations were formed to represent this branch of EMS, including AIMS, the Association of Air Medical Services, the National Flight Nurses Association, and the National Flight Paramedics Association. In the early 1970s, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration created a new symbol to distinguish and improve the image of EMS. It was called the Star of Life. The snake and staff in the middle of the star are time-honored symbols of healing. Each point in the star has a significant meaning. Detection, reporting, response, on-scene care, care in transit, and transfer to definitive care. We still believed we could solve any problem by spending federal dollars on it. So even while the public was reeling from a tripling in the pump price of gasoline, and despite devastating military reversals in Vietnam, the Congress was passing Public Law 93-154, the EMS Systems Act of 1973. The federal law defined 15 components of an EMS system, from manpower and training to transportation and disaster preparedness, and it provided funding to create more than 300 regional EMS systems throughout the nation. The proposed law and funding program was vetoed by President Nixon in '73, but later was signed by President Ford in '74. The government study of ambulance design had concluded that the station wagons and the limousine chassis that had been used for hearses and ambulances, usually Cadillacs, Oldsmobiles, Buicks, and Pontiacs, were not appropriate for modern patient care. Adequate headroom was the major issue, as well as storage space for the equipment needed by well-trained emergency medical technicians. For a few years after that, a handful of manufacturers continued to build limousine-type ambulances, many of them with severely raised roof lines in order to provide more interior room. The break from the tradition of powerful, low-slung style ambulances was very controversial. Some ambulance service operators left the business rather than switch. At the time, any ambulance purchased with federal funds was required to meet a new federal specification. these federal EMS funds were being used to assist communities all over the country in purchasing new equipment. Very soon, most of the ambulances constructed in the U.S. were built on small truck chassis. Units built on standard truck chassis with modular patient compartments were labeled Type 1. Van-type ambulances with raised roofs were designated as Type 2, and modular units built on a van chassis were designated as Type 3. For a long time, ambulances had been competing with garbage trucks, taxi cabs, and school buses on a limited number of very high frequency, or VHF, radio channels. After several years of receiving complaints about this competition for radio frequencies, the Federal Communications Commission came up with a new nationwide design for EMS communications. It was called the Common System Approach, based on radio communications used in Great Lakes shipping.
That's the way, I like it, that's the way, I like it, that's the way,
In 1975, a mere 7 years after the American College of Emergency Physicians had formed, the Conservative American Medical Association recommended that emergency medicine be recognized as a specialty. That same year, the National Association of Emergency Medical Technicians was formed. 1976 was a year of celebration in the United States. The nation celebrated its 200th birthday. It was also the year President Carter was elected. In spite of lots of distractions, work continued on numerous efforts to improve EMS. Also in that year, the Comptroller General of the United States issued a report to the Congress titled Progress but Problems in Developing Emergency Medical Services Systems. Those of us who were working in the trenches at the time felt that the Comptroller General based here in Washington, D.C. really didn't know how to measure our progress and had little appreciation for the difficulties that we were facing as we tried to reverse decades of neglect. By 1977, the roster of important performers in EMS was growing, from paramedics to first responders. Everybody on the team had special training needs. Recognizing the importance of EMS training, the National Council of State EMS Training Coordinators was formed. 12 years after the 1966 White Paper, the federal effort to improve EMS would soon be fighting for its life as the Carter administration sought to eliminate or trim programs it had inherited.
Man, you can tell by the way I use my walk, I'm a woman's man, no time to talk. Music loud, the women walk, I've been kicked around since I was born. Now it's alright, it's okay.
As a nation, we reeled from the impact of disasters and shocking tragedies in 1978 and 79. In San Diego, an airliner collided with a small plane, killing 144 people. The nuclear accident at the 3 Mile Island Energy Facility in Pennsylvania frightened millions who were downwind of it, and it changed the direction of our national energy policy. In Iran, our national dignity was assaulted as religious fanatics seized our embassy and took American citizens as hostages. The Iranian hostage crisis preoccupied the Carter administration for the rest of its term, and earlier threats to kill the federal EMS program weren't carried out. Meanwhile, emergency medicine was officially recognized as the 23rd medical specialty. In an effort to standardize all the paramedic training programs that were developing across the country, a joint review committee was founded. The private ambulance industry formed the American Ambulance Association in 1979, and a new monthly EMS publication was introduced. It was called GEMS, the Journal of Emergency Medical Services. And to signal its editorial direction and attract attention, the first issue of GEMS featured a cover with pictures of all of its competitors' publications. Emergency physicians completed the quest for specialty status in 1980 as the American Board of Emergency Medicine began conducting certifying examinations. In that same year, the National Registry of Emergency Medical Technicians approved a standardized national exam for EMT intermediates. A fire at the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas killed 80 people and inspired stricter fire safety standards for hotels throughout North America. And Ronald Reagan was elected President of the U.S. In March 1981, President Reagan was critically injured by a would-be assassin's bullet. Within minutes, the president was in the hands of a skilled team at a well-equipped trauma center. At the time, the Reagan administration was considering a premature end to federal funding of regional EMS system development. We wondered whether the system's success in saving the president's life would change his administration's plans. It didn't seem to make a difference. The federal budget for 1981 replaced the National EMS Development Program with block grants that could be administered by the states as they saw fit. A lot of the regional EMS programs didn't survive the move into block grants. They didn't have an established financial base nor sufficient community support to continue without direct federal funding. In February 1981, Dr. Jeff Clausen launched a revolution when he introduced the concept of medical priority dispatching and the new profession of emergency medical dispatcher. In July 1981, emergency services in Kansas City, Missouri experienced one of the most difficult disasters ever seen in America.
We have a major emergency at the Hyatt Regency Hotel.
A walkway over the lobby of the Hyatt Hotel suddenly collapsed, sending tons of steel and concrete onto the crowded dance floor below it. Jim Taylor was one of the paramedics who arrived within minutes of the collapse.
There is no way that I can explain to you the helplessness that overcame me when I saw what had happened. There must have been more than 100 people dead or in major trauma. The whole place looked like a bomb had gone off in the middle of all these people. It was shocking.
Jim Taylor rose to the occasion on that awful night in Kansas City. His experience as a paramedic combined with his natural leadership abilities to thrust him into the role of coordinator of rescue operations. Working side by side with emergency physician Joe Wackerly, Taylor could be seen throughout the night, often standing atop the fallen catwalk, megaphone in hand, directing and coordinating EMS personnel. 13 days into 1982, our nation's capital was struck by two transportation disasters within 150 minutes. An Air Florida 737 crashed into the frozen Potomac River shortly after takeoff, and a subway collision occurred between two metro trains. Rescue and EMS resources were stretched to the limit. Believe it or not, in 1982, personal computers were just making an entry into our world, and the people of EMS were beginning to explore their potential. But even those of us who understood how a computer worked, or at least knew how to turn one on, couldn't have imagined the internet, the World Wide Web, pen-based computing, or digital technology. In 1983, EMS consultant Jack Stout introduced an ambulance deployment strategy called System Status Management. According to veteran paramedics, this concept radically changed the dynamics of working the street. For managers of both public and private systems, the concept changed forever the economics of providing ambulance service. Our professional skills were again in demand when the California community of Coalinga was devastated by an earthquake, and EMS providers along the Texas Gulf Coast fought the awesome forces of nature to aid their fellow citizens in the wake of Hurricane Alicia, the worst disaster to strike the area in 22 years. 2 years had passed since the acquired immune deficiency syndrome was identified, and the people of EMS were reacting, and in some cases overreacting, to the threat of AIDS and other infectious diseases. In November 1983, after convening in Des Moines, Iowa, an esteemed body of cardiologists and emergency physicians issued a policy statement in support of the then controversial use of automatic and semi-automatic defibrillators by basic life support personnel. It's believed that this statement accelerated nationwide acceptance of defibrillation as an element of first response.
Built this city. We built this city on rock and roll.
In 1985, a new organization was born, the National Association of EMS Physicians. Meanwhile, a sizable increase in the number of homeless people throughout America began to add stress to EMS systems, which in many cases had become the only source of medical care for this segment of the population. Nonetheless, progress in EMS continued. It was 1987 when we saw the first versions of electronic tracking of ambulance vehicles. As the modern era of EMS reached the age of maturity, one of the prevalent concerns was professionalism, and many pre-hospital workers were wondering aloud, who am I? What's expected of me? Where are we going? And how do we get there? In 1989, we faced the prospect of increased regulation of the tools and devices used in pre-hospital care. At the same time, the use of pneumatic anti-shock garments in cases of penetrating trauma was being challenged. As the newness of modern EMS wore off and public expectations increased, lawsuits became a reality to be dealt with in many systems. Although the frequency of claims and suits against EMS systems has remained relatively low, the prospect of being forced to defend oneself in a courtroom added to the stress and strain of being a pre-hospital worker in America. As the giddy economics of the 80s were giving way to reality, pre-hospital EMS was dealing with the day-to-day challenges of being the safety net for collapsing urban health care and social services. Every day in most urban centers, ambulances and their patients were being turned away from hospitals on diversion. Our southeastern states were racked by Hurricane Hugo, and EMS systems in that area were pressed to the limit under the most adverse circumstances. In October 1989, although the Loma Prieta earthquake near San Francisco cost dozens of lives and billions in property damage, emergency services rose to the challenge of the catastrophe. We entered the last decade of the 20th century on a sober note. We had the knowledge and skill to save the lives of many trauma victims who would otherwise die, but we didn't have the money. In 1990, after several years of consideration by the Congress, the Trauma Care Systems Planning and Development Act was enacted. However, barely enough funding was provided to open and staff a federal agency to administer the program. The prospect of federal funds to assist in providing trauma care remained elusive. An effort by terrorists in that same year to destroy one of the Twin Towers here at the World Trade Center created one of the biggest challenges ever faced by an EMS system. A powerful bomb placed in a van which was driven into an underground parking garage weakened the support structures, ignited numerous fires, and spread smoke throughout the 110 floors of the building. Despite the resulting chaos, New York City's EMS and public safety agencies responded in textbook fashion.
I can't find my baby. I don't know when, I don't know why. Why he's gone away and I don't know where he can be. My baby.
In less than 25 years, many advances had been made in EMS. Most striking was the high caliber of motivated, dedicated people who were choosing pre-hospital EMS as their career. Many of them were building their own career ladder. By 1990, nearly 100 people who'd started on the street as EMTs and paramedics were enrolled in medical schools. In 1990, a sleeping giant began to stir. After decades of limited interest in EMS, the major fire service organizations jointly resolved to expand fire service influence and involvement. But the politics of major fire service organizations and EMS didn't mean much to those veterans who'd already spent 20 years or more dealing with the real world of rescue and EMS on the streets of America. People like Captain Danny Daniels of Jacksonville.
22 years on the job, probably 30,000 runs, both on duty and off duty. Runs where people have been, heads have been blown off, children have been brutally murdered, a man got chewed up by a stump grinding machine. But none of those runs stick out and remain ingrained in my mind more than the morning where Donald Denmark and myself on Rescue 28 and Engine 44 with Captain Phil Edens and his crew rolled up on the Bay Meadows incident, the GMAC massacre. It's still there. I can still picture it that morning. I can remember everything about it and withdraw it from the subconscious. It was just unbelievable.
We got a call at around 11 o'clock that Life Flight was bringing multiple gunshot wound victims into Baptist. When the patients arrived, we had 3 victims total here. Our understanding is that there were 7 or 8 people dead at the scene, including the gunman who opened fire with a semi-automatic weapon.
It's something that even though we've been through stress debriefing, it still brings tears to my eyes, and I mean, I can't help it. That's a needless waste.
Another major stress faced by the people of EMS is dealing with the injuries and illnesses suffered by children.
You talk to paramedics and EMTs, and if they're honest with you and they'll tell you one area that they really feel uncomfortable in, it is the area of pediatrics.
But discomfort with pediatrics isn't limited to the street. And in 1991, the continuing maturation of EMS brought the approval of pediatric emergency medicine as a subspecialty of emergency medicine and pediatrics. And the new Commission on Accreditation of Ambulance Services began the process of accrediting those applicants that met its standards. Meanwhile, as America's mean streets got meaner, the risk of violent assaults on caregivers also increased. In some urban centers, EMTs and paramedics went shopping for body armor. During 1991 and 92, Mother Nature offered up some violent reminders that she's still the boss. In Oakland, California, across the bay from San Francisco, hot, dry winds primed the combustible vegetation to burn with hellish fury, killing several people and destroying more than 3,000 buildings. The other extreme of natural disaster visited South Florida and Hawaii in the form of Hurricanes Andrew and Iniki, again challenging the people of EMS to do their jobs in the face of awesome and dangerous obstacles. In August 1992, another EMS milestone occurred as 4 private ambulance companies merged under the name of American Medical Response and began to sell stock through the New York Stock Exchange. This led to the formation of several other companies which sought capital through public sale of stock and large-scale borrowing and sparked a nationwide consolidation of the private ambulance industry. But 1992 will be remembered by most Americans as the year of the Los Angeles riots. Most of us watched the event on TV from the safety of our homes, while our colleagues in LA continued to serve ill and injured people under impossible and very dangerous circumstances. These were conditions that the authors of the 1966 White Paper on EMS could not have imagined. But the courage and dedication displayed by emergency workers a quarter century later surely would have impressed them. EMS workers in several central states were challenged by another of nature's quirks. This time it was flooding, and the task of getting to and transporting ill and injured people was compounded by roads that were covered by several feet of muddy water and bridges that were closed to traffic. In 1993, we began to explore the potential of expanded roles for paramedics. Although a massive restructuring of the American healthcare system was proposed by the Clinton administration, it was rejected by the Congress. Nonetheless, the marketplace began to force many changes in the system, and some of those changes seemed to include opportunities for providing a wide range of patient care services, including primary care by allied healthcare personnel. The prospect of expanded scope paramedics treating illnesses and minor injuries in patients' homes without the need for transport to a hospital was widely discussed and debated.
You make me feel like living. Make me feel alive. You come into my life. Make me feel alive.
By 1994, with the increased prevalence of airborne and bloodborne pathogens and the potential contraction of deadly diseases and all the other hazards faced by EMS workers, the world was a very, very different place than that which was the focus of the 1966 White Paper. And we now have the advantage of tools and technology that the authors of the White Paper could not have dreamed of. At the same time, we're facing changes in the structure and financing of healthcare that clearly will alter who you work for, how you do your job, what you'll do for patients, and where you'll take those who are transported. In 1995, all the debate about structure and finance and public versus private was eclipsed by a real-life product of man's inhumanity to man. The unthinkable happened, and most of us watched on television as our colleagues in Oklahoma City epitomized all that EMS is supposed to be. At the same time, most of us realized that the event had robbed our nation of its sense of security, innocence, and isolation. So here we are at the end of our journey through modern EMS. By its very nature, EMS is about unfortunate events. The time we have to live is less than the blink of an eye when compared to the age of our universe. When viewed against this background, the events to which you respond may seem insignificant by comparison. But they're important, very important. No matter how fragile and short the reign of humanity on this earth, or maybe because of that, we value life. We value the individual and the dignity of the individual. By offering offering immediate help to others, you add a positive dimension to mere existence and survival. The history of EMS is filled with calamities and setbacks, as well as human disorder and violence. We might be tempted to see this as a decline of civilization. Instead, we'd urge you to acknowledge and celebrate the threads of concern and generosity, even some acts of heroism that you weave through the fabric of your communities. In stark contrast to the steady diet of bad news, those who've gone before and those who are now involved in any aspect of emergency medical services have not wavered from our central purpose. We always come back to it, as we have since the beginning. That central purpose, caring for others in their times of greatest need, has been the motivation for this celebration of the history of modern EMS. Yours is a heritage to be proud of, a heritage of growth and continual improvement. But this is not an ending. You've inherited the future. Go forth and continue the progress.